I don't know what you meditated about in gratitude for those few little moments, but I went back and thought about butter again. You see, I was one of those people that liked to just eat it just plain like her mama did. And what I would do when I was a child, I would open that refrigerator and I would slyly, secretly stick my finger in that Land O'Lakes butter that was on the plate there, and stick it right in the middle of it, get a little piece of it, and lick it off. And then I'd go about my business. And later in the day, when I passed the refrigerator, I would open it again, put my finger in that butter and lick it off. So that probably by the end of the day, it had all these little places on it. I thought I was being very secretive about slyly getting those tastes of butter. Later on, as I got older and realized that was not being secretive, my mama told me the truth of the butter, that she always left one out in front for my finger. She didn't use that butter for her cooking. She had but that was the butter for Jane to stick her finger in. And I'm grateful that she allowed me to do that. I no longer stick my finger in the butter. I use a spoon. But now we're not going to visualize butter. I want to ask you to visualize something else. I invite you to close your eyes and visualize what we often refer to as the first Thanksgiving in America. The one along the shores of the Massachusetts Bay with the Pilgrims and their Native American neighbors back in 1621. And it's okay to visualize it like you were taught about it in elementary school. So just picture that. Picture that in your head. Now you can open your eyes. Somebody just shouted out, what is something you saw? What did you see?
Butter.
Whether it was there or not, we've got our mind on it now. Okay, what else?
People wrapped up.
Wrapped up. It was cold. People wrapped up. What else did you see?
Native Americans.
There were the Native Americans there. Yes. How were they dressed?
Careful.
In your mind?
Like the movies.
They didn't have hardly anything on, right? I don't know. All right, what else?
A long table.
Long table. Long table.
Plates of venison.
What?
Sharing.
Sharing. Sharing. What kind of food did you see?
Plates of venison.
Venison? Anything else?
Corn.
Corn.
Bread.
Bread.
Turkey.
Turkey. All right. Those are all the kind of things we see. Some may have been true, and other parts have been added in the tradition. It wasn't actually, of course, the first Thanksgiving. Both Native Americans and Europeans had been having harvest Thanksgiving festivals for ages, right? And there were others noted in our history which some consider as first Thanksgiving, like after the Thanksgiving festival that was proclaimed in Massachusetts in 1647 after the massacre of the Pequot people. But the 1621 feast, that feast in 1621, is what people later looked back on and lifted up in the history books. The holiday wasn't made official until 1863. That's when it became official, when Abraham Lincoln declared it as a kind of thank you for the Civil War victories in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And we had an official Thanksgiving. Another myth may be the makeup menu, turkey and sweet potato pie. There was no mention of turkey at the 1621 bounty, and there was no pie. They had no ovens or flour, and no sweet potatoes. It is recorded that the Wampanoag natives brought 5 deer, there was venison there, to the feast, and that the pilgrims went out for wild fowl. So there may have been wild fowl as well if they had a good hunt. Possibly ducks or geese or turkey. In our elementary school plays, the pilgrims invite the Indians but there's no mention of an invitation. Perhaps the leaders decided to gather in some form of diplomacy to join their fall feasts. They do mention the games, though, so that was true that they played some games. So all is well. As the book we've heard today said, whatever it might have been was what it was, and it was all thankful and well. The role of Squanto is also complicated. It wasn't just some native coming out of the woods to help. He was more like their savior, you know. Tisquantum is his name, actually. He's known as Squanto. He's part of the Patuxet, a band of the Wampanoag tribe. He previously had lived right where the Pilgrims settled. That's where his settlement, his people were. He was captured, though, by the English on an early exploration back in 1614 and sold into slavery, first in Spain and then later in England, where he learned English. So he lived with a while with the Europeans, picked up their ways, learned their language, learned the English language. He was able to catch a ride back to his homeland. When he got back, though, he found that all of the people in his little village were dead of the plague, every one of them, brought to them, of course, by the Europeans. Nevertheless, when the Pilgrims showed up in that deserted place, he sort of adopted them. He had kind of joined with some other neighboring bands by then, but he saw them there in his old homeland and felt some compassion for them there. He assisted them, translated for them with the other natives, taught them how to grow that corn that they obviously probably did have that first Thanksgiving, and more. So why do we bother to lift up this little band of Europeans? And why am I sharing about this here at the Unitarian Universalist congregation here in Statesboro? Well, folks, these are our spiritual ancestors. The little church they formed there, that little church, that little band formed there in Plymouth, is now the Unitarian Universalist congregation. The oldest one in America. The oldest one in America. First parish there in Plymouth. The parish meeting house that is now there, that was built in 1899, it was built to replace a church that was burned. Our former members, Pauline and Bob Delar, are members there. So I'm envisioning quilts on the wall. Right? This little band of settlers did not have an easy time of it. They were severely persecuted back in Scrooby, England. William Bradford, the first governor of the new colony, describes what life was like for the separatists in England. This is a quote from him. They could not long continue in any peaceable condition, but were hunted and persecuted on every side, so as their former afflictions were but as flea-bitings in comparison with those now come upon them. Some were taken and clapped up in prison. Others had their homes beset and watched night and day, and hardly escaped their hands. And the most were fain to flee and leave their houses and habitations, and the means of their livelihoods. Yet, seeing themselves thus molested, and that there was no hope of their continuance there, by a joint consent, they resolved to go into the Low Countries, where they heard was freedom of religion for all. So, these separatists, this little band from Scrooby, England, left for religious freedom, or freedom at least from the Church of England, who was imposing all these things. And they first settled in Holland in the Low Countries. That was where they found they could settle and worship as they pleased. But they became very concerned because their children began to pick up the Dutch ways and the Dutch language. And that was not what they wanted. So they got back in the ship and went back to England to prepare to set out for a new home in the New World. Now they were hoping to end up a little further south, but they had bad weather and ended up about 300 miles north of what they hoped. And of course their ship was the Mayflower. They started out in 2 ships actually, and one of them took on water and went back to England, and loaded everything down on the Mayflower. They were very crowded on there. Probably all of them did not get to go, but then they came, as you know the story, on the Mayflower. I had a little short video clip this morning. This comes off of PBS, a little clip about their journey.
On Friday, December 15th, 1620, with its cargo of sickened and sea-weary passengers and crew, the Mayflower sailed west towards the dark, wintry shore that awaited them.
They arrive just at the worst possible time. Winter is just coming in.
The Mayflower had to anchor a mile offshore because the harbour at Plymouth wasn't deep enough to let the ship right up, so that they had to ferry the supplies, the goods, so slowly in from the Mayflower.
Everything was wrong. I mean, they had to reach the shore by wading through ice-cold water, and they caught cold and they died.
They had just set to work building a 21-square-foot common house when the temperature dropped and the weather closed in mercilessly. One by one, the weakened immigrants began to succumb to dysentery, pneumonia, tuberculosis, exposure. By February, people were dying in droves. Some huddled in the makeshift settlement, with more back on the Mayflower, which had been converted to a hospital for the sick and a hospice for the dying.
The conditions on board that ship must have been absolutely awful. That sweet ship, the Mayflower, by the end of it's like a death house on the water.
Of 18 couples that came over, only 3 remained intact. Everywhere you have widows and widowers and orphans. So there's no one who is not grieving, who is not mourning someone.
By the spring, half of them are dead. 50-some people die that first year.
So, pretty tough time coming, and a pretty tough time after they arrived. So much that most of them lost their family members. You heard them say of the 18 couples, families, there were only 3 that were left, so widows and widowers and orphans left. Half of them died that first winter. The settlement that they ended up was the former home of Squanto's tribe, and they strived to do their best to make it through that winter. It was bitter and hard. They ended up learning from Squanto, though, and then when the spring came, they did their planting, and they had a good summer crop, and they decided to celebrate a year after they got there, the next fall, decided to celebrate. In his musings about this, Reverend Scott Alexander writes, "It is spiritually important that we not romanticize that first American Thanksgiving as some carefree festival of reckless joy. With apologies to Hallmark and my well-meaning 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Daly, the pilgrims seated at that first Thanksgiving table were haggard survivors, exhausted men and women, still thin and weak, wearing little more than rags. Yes, they were grateful to have endured, to be sure, but looming over whatever happy feelings they mustered must have lingered incredibly deep measures of grief and fear. It's a miracle of the heart that those pilgrims could even think about giving thanks to God or celebrating life's bounty with their Wampanoag neighbors. No one could have really blamed them if, as the first anniversary of their arrival in America approached, they decided to hold a service of mourning for the dead and withdrawn into their own sadness in the gathering with the autumnal darkness. It seems to me that what makes the real Thanksgiving story so remarkable is not the joy with which the pilgrims and the natives shared on that day, but rather their painful backdrop of grief was not allowed to block out their celebration. What makes that first American Harvest Festival so nobly instructive is our remembering the profound depths of misery which preceded the Pilgrims' decision to celebrate and share. Somehow, they were able to choose gratitude over bitterness, generosity over greed, thanksgiving over self-pity. And so that is why I chose to share about this first Thanksgiving to begin my message that responds to that question that I've been asking all fall. What are we here for? The response today is to grow gratitude. And our spiritual ancestors provide a good example for us. These Thanksgiving pilgrims had endured terrible hardships and had another perhaps terrible winter before them that November. Don't you imagine they're remembering what happened the last year? Yet they chose to focus on gratitude. Now, these pilgrims did not have the research to back up their actions as beneficial. They were just grateful folks. But unlike our spiritual ancestors, we UUs who love good evidence, don't we? Give me some evidence. Do have significant research pointing to the positive outcomes of expressing gratitude. So I went to the Harvard Medical School site to get this information to share with you, so hopefully you'll deem it credible. Two psychologists, Dr. Robert A. Emmons of the University of California, Davis, and Dr. Michael E. McCullough of the University of Miami, have done much of the research about gratitude. In one study, they asked all participants to write a few sentences each week, focusing on particular topics. One group wrote about things they were grateful for that had occurred during the week. A second group wrote about daily irritations or things that had displeased them. And the third wrote about events that affected them with no emphasis on being positive or negative. After 10 weeks of doing this, those who wrote about gratitude were more optimistic and felt better about their lives. And surprisingly, get this, they also exercised more. How about that? And had fewer visits to physicians than those who focused on sources of aggravation. Another leading researcher in this field, Dr. Martin E.P. Seligman, a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania, tested the impact of various positive psychology interventions on 411 people, each compared with a control assignment of writing about early memories. You know how we like to have our control groups. When their week's assignment was to write and person deliver a letter of gratitude. Write and deliver a letter of gratitude to someone who had never been properly thanked for his or her kindness. Participants immediately exhibited a huge increase in happiness scores when they did this. This impact was greater than that of any other intervention, with benefits lasting a month after they had done this letter and made sure this person got it. It even wasn't just for that day, an immediate thing. It had longer lasting effects. Of course, studies such as this one cannot prove cause and effect, but most of the studies published on this topic support an association between gratitude and an individual's well-being. Other studies have looked at how gratitude can improve relationships. For example, a study of couples found that individuals who took time to express gratitude for their partner, thank you, Greg, not only felt more positive toward the other person, but also felt more comfortable in expressing concerns about their relationship. So if they took the time to say thank you about something and were disciplined about that, then they were more likely to be able to talk about the tough stuff, which is sometimes harder to do. And there were other studies that describe how gratitude motivated folks in their workplace, but I'm not going to go over all of those with you too. Now, there are some notable exceptions to the generally positive research on gratitude. So to be honest with you, I will tell you it doesn't always show up. One study found that middle-aged divorced women who kept gratitude journals were no more satisfied with their lives than those who did not. Now, maybe they were very still had a lot of gratitude, I don't know, or maybe they'd learned to overlook a lot of stuff, or maybe maybe it was just kind of a tough time for them. Another study found that children and adolescents who wrote and delivered a thank you note to someone who had made a difference in their lives may have made the other person happy, the person they delivered the letter to, but did not improve their own well-being. This finding suggests that gratitude is an attainment associated with emotional maturity. So when you make your children write those thank you notes, that will help the other person, but don't necessarily think that that's going to make them any happier. I hated writing thank you notes when I was a child. I will admit that I hated writing thank you notes. I can assure you that it did not make me happier. But in my old age, perhaps I've developed that emotional maturity or just have more wisdom. I am learning that when I incorporate gratitude as a discipline, a practice of expressing gratitude, it does help me, and I hope it helps the folks that I am thanking. Did you get a thank you note from me today, this week? Some of you did. I sat down and for 3 or 4 days made thank you notes for each person who submitted a pledge to us this year. Now, if you didn't get yours yet, it may be lost in the mail, or maybe you didn't submit your pledge yet. But I'll get one to you. And as I drew or colored in your chalice or whatever it was that I put on your card, I purposefully, with each stroke, thought about you and the gifts that you bring to this congregation and to me personally. And with each stroke, I felt and I expressed gratitude, as I did when I wrote the note. So it's made a difference with me. Here's some other practices in addition to writing notes that the folks at Harvard suggest. Write notes, that's one thing. Another is to thank someone mentally, just mentally. No time to write? It may help just to think about someone that has done something nice for you and mentally thank that person, even if they've gone on to the great beyond. But think about someone and mentally thank them. And I invite you to take a moment now and do that now. Mentally think of someone and mentally thank them. And another, of course, is to keep a gratitude journal. Make it a habit to write down or share with a loved one thoughts about gifts that you've received each day, things that you're grateful about for that day. Some folks do this as a blessing at dinner with their loved ones, but just a notepad to write down some things. Another, count your many blessings, name them one by one. They suggest that you pick a time each week to sit down and write about your blessings, reflecting on what went right or what you're grateful for. And sometimes it's helpful to pick a number, like I'm going to do 3 things, write down 3 things each week, or 5 things, whatever that number is. But make it a discipline to count your blessings. As you write, be specific and think about the sensations you felt when something good happened to you. Like the poet Alexander thinking about that butter. Recall that, the feelings that you had when that good thing happened or when you saw that pretty sunset, whatever it was. And finally, they suggest that you can pray. People who are religious can use prayer to cultivate gratitude and or meditate. Mindfulness meditation involves focusing on the present without judgment. Now, often people focus on a word or a phrase, something like peace, but it's also possible to focus on what you're grateful for, like the warmth of the sun or being with people who care today. Even a pleasant sound, just focusing on that. Now, sometimes it is hard to focus on our blessings. Let's not kid ourselves. Sometimes it's hard when life is hitting us hard. I don't want to be all Pollyanna and say you don't feel the hurt or the pain or the bitterness. Yeah. Some seasons are tough. Of course you do. Of course I do. I was trying to enjoy a birthday party the other night, and I get a phone call that my grandson's in a terrible wreck with my great-granddaughter. They're okay. But, yeah, I mean, how am I being happy, when I got that on my mind? And that's why, though, I look to stories like the first Thanksgiving to motivate me. These Unitarian Universalist spiritual ancestors and the native folks had all been through countless hells, lost loved ones, experienced sickness, starvation, and deep, deep grief. Yet on that day in November 1621, they came together to share their food, and share their gratitude, and were all better for it. Some say that as Unitarian Universalists, that we folks have no central religious faith practice as other religions do. Reverend Galen Gungerich addressed this in a sermon at All Souls, New York in 2007. It's entitled The Heart of Our Faith. And I want to share a little bit about what he said about that. He said, I realize the idea of faith as a discipline may also sound like heresy to many Unitarian Universalists, having a discipline. Unless our faith is mere intellectual affection, however, the defining element of our faith must be a daily practice of some kind. What kind of practice? For Jews, the defining discipline is obedience. That's their defining discipline. To be a faithful Jew is to obey the commands of God. For Christians, the defining discipline is love. To be a faithful Christian is to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. For Muslims, the defining discipline is submission. To be a faithful Muslim is to submit to the will of Allah. And what for us? What should be our defining religious discipline? While obedience, love, and even submission each play a vital role in the life of faith, says this minister, Reverend Gungerich, and maybe me too. He says, my current conviction is that our defining discipline should be gratitude. In the same way that Judaism is defined by obedience, Christianity by love, and Islam by submission, I believe that Unitarian Universalism should be defined by gratitude. I like that as a central practice for Unitarian Universalism. Being grateful. Being grateful. So this week especially, let us commit to that practice and ethic of gratitude. And let us start today by being grateful for what we find here at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Statesboro. On Friday, I wrote to our listserv and our Facebook group, and I asked folks to help me compose a liturgy of gratitude, and I'm grateful that many of you did respond. I've taken your responses and summarized and edited them into a little liturgy for us. I'll share some of the things mentioned, and your response will simply be, we are so grateful. Let's practice that. We are so grateful for a wonderful meeting house without a mortgage that is in a great location. We are so grateful for good worship services and programs provided each Sunday morning. We are so grateful for our UU Church home away from home for some folks who are greeted with deep smiles and wonderful welcome back and nice to see you again. We are so grateful For the good folks who get here early and prepare coffee and refreshments every Sunday without fail. We are so grateful. That was a little louder, see? For those who've accepted leadership positions on the board and in committees and given more than their share of time, talents, and treasure to this congregation, we are so grateful. For a place where everyone's gifts are valued, and I would say even the gift of regular attendance, just showing up here every Sunday and I'm coming, know I will see your face. We are so grateful. For the interesting and caring people we meet here and the friendships we make. We are so grateful. For teachers and childcare folks who give their love and time to our children while teaching and modeling our principles and values. We are so grateful. For parents and grandparents who get up on Sunday in time to get themselves and their child or children to church, contributing their energy to our synergy, enlarging our village and enriching us all. We are so grateful. For the folks who work in the broader community on behalf of our congregation to bring nourishment, peace, justice, and love to all, we are so grateful. For our shared ministry, including our professional minister, our pastoral care associate, and many other lay folks who contribute to our ministry, we are so grateful. For the creation of a place for community, a place to respond to the injustices of the world, a place to share our time, talents, and treasure, a place to celebrate who we are, a place to honor life and death, a place to simply love one another, and a place to grow gratitude. We are so grateful. May it continue to be so. Blessed be.